I assume that most of you are already familiar with sonnets, but I thought it would be helpful to spend a little bit of time going over the basics just to be sure everyone is on the same page. I want to talk briefly about the history of the sonnet in England, and to detail some of the basic structural elements of the form, and then talk in more specific ways about how Shakespeare dealt with the traditions that he inherited. We begin, of course, not in 16th century England, but in 14th century Italy, where Francesco Petrarch fell hopelessly in love with a woman he called Laura. Scholars are divided over whether this was a real person or an idealized creation of Petrarch's, but for our own purposes, the questions don't really matter. What does matter is that Petrarch wrote hundreds of sonnets giving voice to his unrequited love for this woman. He did not invent the sonnet, but by the 16th century in England, he was largely considered to be the master of the form. We credit two aristocratic writers of the early Tudor period with introducing the sonnet to England: Sir Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, working mainly in the 1520s and 1530s, translated Petrarch's poems and developed sonnets of their own. Their work was not published during their lifetime. In those days, poetry was a sideline occupation for the nobility, and manuscripts would have circulated among their friends. It's not until 1557 that printer Richard Tottle published a little tome called Songs and Sonnets that the work of Wyatt and Surrey began to find a larger audience. That was the first anthology of poetry published in English, and it set off a vogue for the sonnet that was simply overwhelming. Tottle's Miscellany, as the anthology came to be known, went through 7 editions in the next 30 years. Queen Elizabeth came to the throne the year after Tottle's Miscellany was published, in 1558, and during her lifetime, anyone who wanted to be taken seriously as a poet had to demonstrate a mastery of the sonnet. As an abbreviated list gives us an idea of just how popular the style was. Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella came out in 1591 posthumously, collecting poems that he had been writing in the 1580s. Samuel Daniel published Delia in 1592. Michael Drayton produced Idea's Mirror in 1594. Edmund Spenser's Amoretti was published in 1595. One interesting note about Spenser's poems: they are unusual for celebrating a successful courtship. Spenser married his beloved Elizabeth Boyle in 1594. Even Queen Elizabeth wrote sonnets of her own. So when William Shakespeare was working to establish a name for himself in the early 1590s, it's not surprising at all that he was writing sonnets. When the playhouses were closed due to plague in 1592-1593, Shakespeare published 2 long narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, but he was probably working on his sonnets at the same time. Those did not see the light of day, however, until a couple of them were stolen by an unscrupulous publisher and released in 1599 as part of a volume called The Passionate Pilgrim. Shakespeare probably decided to revise and develop his poems in light of this transgression, and in 1609 the volume Shakespeare's Sonnets was finally published. So what is a sonnet? What sets it apart from other types of short poetry? The sonnet has a very specific length, 14 lines of iambic pentameter. You'll remember, I hope, that the iamb is a term for a basic foot of poetry, consisting of 1 unstressed syllable followed by 1 stressed syllable. I use the mnemonic I am to remember the pattern. The syllable am is stressed, while the first syllable I is not. String 5 of those together in a single line, you have an iambic pentameter line. String 14 of those lines together, you might just have a sonnet. The reason I say might is that there's another structural expectation, though this one is more flexible, some may say squishier. Petrarch and most of the Italian sonneteers divided their poems into 2 basic units. The first 8 lines, the octave, established a topic for the poem, and the remaining 6 lines, the sestet, developed or responded to that topic. When the form made the move to England, poets gradually shifted away from this structure and popularized a pattern of 3 4-line units called quatrains, followed by a couplet, 2 lines that wrapped up the poem's ideas. These aren't absolute laws, of course, but in general, when we read an Italian sonnet, we expect to see that octave sestet pattern. And when we read an English sonnet, we expect to see 3 quatrains and a couplet. Spenser is something of an exception to this, but then Spenser more or less stands alone in any number of ways, And since we're really interested in Shakespeare here, we won't worry too much about Spenser. Just what are we looking at when we talk about octaves or quatrains, sestets, couplets? Poets have two basic methods to signal these structural units in their poems: punctuation and rhyme. Punctuation is pretty straightforward. Typically, we'll see a period or perhaps a semicolon establishing the conclusion of a thought. So if there's a period at the end of line 4 and line 8, we can feel safe talking about quatrains. But if there's a comma or no punctuation at all at the end of line 4, but there is one at the end of line 8, we're probably looking at an octave. The other clue is to look at the way the lines of the poem rhyme. Most of Petrarch's Italian sonnets will have two rhymes in the octave, usually following an A, B, B, A, B, B, A pattern. The sestet gets a little bit more complex, but on the whole you'll see either 2 or 3 rhymes in a completely different pattern that's distinct from the octave. In the English sonnet style mastered by Shakespeare, each quatrain generally follows an A-B pattern. The first and third lines rhyme, as do the second and the fourth. Typically, each quatrain is self-contained, so you'll get a new set of rhyming sounds in each unit following the same pattern. In other words, the first 12 lines give us this structure: A, B, C, D, E, F. The concluding couplet rhymes only with itself, so we add that G to get the complete rhyme scheme. Why does this matter? Generally, form follows meaning, so explicating the structure of the poem gives us useful insights into the way Shakespeare is organizing his thinking. We expect each quatrain to articulate its idea or build upon the previous quatrain. And as you practice, you'll get more comfortable exploring the interactivity between the quatrains. Sometimes each can more or less stand apart. Other times, they develop in a linear fashion. It will help, too, if you watch out for signaling words, often conjunctions such as but, thus, yet, so, then. Those can help signal a shift in the discussion. That final couplet, however, usually acts as a summation or a declaration of significance. The poet is saying, hey, this is why what I've been talking about in the first 12 lines of the poem are so important. Often, Shakespeare being Shakespeare, that last couplet introduces an ironic twist or a radical change of direction, something that forces us to go back and reevaluate the ideas of the poem as a whole. For me, the best way to analyze a sonnet by Shakespeare is, oddly enough, to remember that he was a playwright as well as a poet. I imagine the speaker of the poem struggling, sometimes desperately, sometimes hopefully, to communicate with the person being addressed. Reading the poem as a dramatic monologue helps me think about its rhetorical strategies. Is the voice angry, pleading, expectant? Does the speaker expect the beloved to agree with what he is asking, or to reject him, or even to listen to him? How does the tone or mood of that voice change over the course of the poem? Then I look at the structure and the rhyme scheme of the poem to begin finding ways of answering those questions. The result, of course, is never a declaration, this is what the poem means. More often, the result is more open-ended. What is the poem asking? Or what is the poem making me think about? If you can get solid answers to those questions, I think you can feel pretty good about the way your exploration of the poem is going.